If you own an Android phone, there's a very real chance that right now, sitting quietly in your app list, is a system service you never agreed to install, never received a clear notification about, and probably don't fully understand. And in this video, we are going to walk through this entire story properly, from the moment people first noticed it, to what Google officially says it does, to the broader pattern of privacy controversies this fits into, to the technical debate happening inside the privacy and security community about this exact kind of feature, and finally, to the practical steps you can take on your own device, all based on real, documented reporting rather than exaggerated internet rumors, because a topic like this deserves a clear-eyed, thorough explanation rather than either blind trust or pure fear-mongering. The service at the center of this story is called Android System Safety Core, and starting in late 2024 and continuing steadily into 2025, users across Reddit, XDA forums, and Android-focused communities began noticing this exact app quietly appearing in their installed apps list on Android 9 and above, without any prompt asking for permission, without a notification explaining what it did, and in some documented cases, without even appearing when people searched for it directly by name inside the Play Store. That last detail is a huge part of why this caused such a stir. People are generally used to Google pushing background updates to core system components, the same way Chrome or Google Play services quietly update themselves behind the scenes. But this was different because Safety Core wasn't a routine security patch. It was a brand new standalone application with its own permissions and its own function, and it appeared silently on people's personal devices as part of a routine Google Play system update. The exact same distribution channel typically used for things like updating WebView. Naturally, when tech-savvy users started digging into their app manager and found something they'd never heard of, with no explanation and no opt-in prompt, the reaction across forums was swift and frankly understandable. Multiple users described going into their settings, finding the app already installed, having no memory of agreeing to it, and immediately uninstalling it out of caution, some leaving one-star reviews describing it as, in their own words, spyware being pushed onto their devices without consent, while others speculated openly about what data it might be collecting and where that data might be going. So what does Google actually say this app is for? According to Google's own description and the reporting that followed, once the backlash grew loud enough to demand an official response, Android System Safety Core is described as a system service designed to provide on-device safety features, and its primary stated function centers on content classification. Specifically, the ability to scan images locally, directly on your device's hardware, to detect sensitive content such as nudity, and then optionally display a warning or blur that content before you actually view it. This feature is most notably tied to Google Messages, where it powers functionality aimed at protecting users, and in particular protecting minors, from unexpectedly receiving explicit images sent to them, blurring the image automatically, and requiring an extra tap to reveal it, similar in spirit to protective features other messaging platforms have rolled out in recent years. On paper, that sounds like a reasonable, even genuinely beneficial safety feature, especially for parents concerned about what their children might encounter through messaging apps. The key phrase Google emphasizes repeatedly throughout its explanation is on-device, meaning the classification and scanning is supposed to happen locally, using the phone's own processing power, rather than sending your photos up to Google's servers for analysis, which is an important distinction from a privacy standpoint, because on-device processing generally means your actual images aren't being uploaded and inspected remotely, only analyzed locally with the end result being a simple flag or warning shown directly to you, the recipient. So if the stated purpose is a legitimate safety feature and the processing genuinely happens locally, why did this become such a significant, sustained privacy controversy rather than a quiet, welcomed addition? The answer comes down almost entirely to how it was rolled out, not necessarily what it technically claims to do. Privacy-conscious users and digital rights advocates raised several serious, legitimate concerns, and it's worth walking through each one carefully. First, there was no clear, upfront consent process of any kind. Users were never asked through a pop-up, settings prompt, or even an email notification, would you like to enable a new content safety feature that scans images on your device? They simply discovered, after the fact, digging through their own settings, that a new system-level app with broad permissions had already been installed and was already actively running in the background. Second, the app reportedly requested fairly broad permissions, including full network access, which understandably raised eyebrows among more technically inclined users, because if the entire point is purely local, on-device processing with no data leaving the phone, people reasonably questioned why a purely local scanning tool would need robust, unrestricted internet, connectivity at all, and Google's public explanations didn't always fully satisfy that specific technical question for every user asking it, leaving room for speculation rather than clear, verifiable answers. Third, This rollout happened using the same silent automatic distribution channel Google typically reserves for essential security: patches, meaning there was no meaningful opportunity for the average user, someone who isn't following tech forums or reading changelog notes, to learn about this new feature in advance, understand what it actually does, and make an informed choice about whether they wanted it running on their personal device at all. And fourth, and this is probably the detail that generated the most suspicion online, several users reported that the app didn't initially appear when they searched for it by name inside the Play Store itself, making it significantly harder for concerned users to find official documentation, read developer information, check reviews, or understand exactly what they were dealing with through the normal channels people typically use to vet unfamiliar software on their devices. Put those four factors together: silent installation, broad permissions, distribution through a channel normally reserved for essential patches, and initial difficulty finding official information through standard channels, and you get exactly the kind of conditions that breed distrust, almost regardless of how genuinely benign the underlying feature might actually be in practice. Now, let's zoom out and place this specific controversy inside a much broader, ongoing technical and philosophical debate happening across the tech industry. Because Safety Core is not the first time a major platform has tried to introduce automated on-device content scanning, and understanding that history adds crucial context to why the privacy and security community reacted so strongly and so quickly. Back in 2021, Apple announced its own version of this concept, a planned system designed to scan photos being uploaded to iCloud for known child sexual abuse material using a cryptographic hash matching technique, meaning it wouldn't be analyzing image content directly in a general sense, but instead comparing mathematical fingerprints of photos against a database of known illegal material. Apple framed this as a targeted, privacy-preserving approach specifically aimed at combating the spread of illegal content. However, the backlash from cryptographers, civil liberties organizations, and security researchers was immediate and intense, not primarily because people doubted the stated intention was good, but because of what security experts call the slippery slope or function creep problem. Once you build a technical infrastructure capable of scanning content directly on a user's own device before encryption or upload, that same infrastructure can, in principle, be repurposed or expanded by the company itself, or under legal or government pressure, to scan for other categories of content entirely, categories that might be politically sensitive, controversial, or specific to a particular country's laws, rather than universally recognized as harmful. Digital rights organizations warned that building this kind of on-device scanning capability, even with the best possible intentions and the narrowest possible initial scope, effectively creates a backdoor mechanism that authoritarian governments or future corporate policy changes could exploit or expand. And once that infrastructure exists on billions of devices, rolling it back or fully trusting its scope becomes much harder. Facing sustained pressure from precisely this coalition of security researchers, privacy advocates, and even some of its own customers, Apple ultimately delayed and eventually significantly scaled back its original photo scanning plans. That history matters enormously here because it means the privacy and security community was already primed, already sensitized, to be deeply skeptical of any major platform introducing automated content scanning that runs directly on a user's personal device, especially when it's rolled out with minimal transparency. So when Safety Core appeared quietly on Android devices with none of the upfront public debate, community consultation, or transparency that even Apple's controversial 2021 proposal eventually received, it's not surprising that alarm bells went off immediately among exactly the people most equipped to recognize the pattern. It's also worth being fair and noting that this wasn't Google's first experience with this general kind of backlash either, and there's a documented pattern here worth understanding fully, because it provides essential context for why so many people reacted with immediate suspicion rather than extending the company the benefit of the doubt. Years earlier, Google faced a lawsuit alleging that the company continued tracking users' mobile app activity even after those users had specifically used Google's own built-in privacy controls to opt out of what's called web and app activity tracking, with the lawsuit alleging that Google kept intercepting app usage and browsing communications despite users following the company's own official instructions to disable it entirely. Around a similar period, Google also faced a separate lawsuit filed by a state attorney general alleging that the company continued location tracking, running in the background for certain features like weather updates and general search functionality, even after users had specifically disabled API. Level location tracking through the settings they believed controlled that behavior, with tracking apparently only stopping once users disabled a much broader system-level location setting, rather than the specific toggle they'd been told would handle it. And going back even further, during the height of the pandemic, Google was reported to have automatically installed official COVID-19 exposure notification and contact tracing apps directly onto Android devices in certain US states without an explicit installation prompt or clear advance notice, a rollout that also generated significant backlash at the time, even though the app in that particular case remained inactive by default and required users to manually opt in before it would actually begin any tracking functionality. So when you zoom out and look at this pattern stretching across several years, silent background installations tied to state, health department contact tracing programs, lawsuits over location tracking, continuing despite users disabling it through settings they were explicitly told would stop it, and lawsuits over app activity tracking persisting after formal opt-out. You can understand why, when SafetyCore quietly appeared on millions of devices with no explanation, so many people immediately assumed the worst, rather than giving Google the benefit of the doubt. In each of these previous cases, the common thread wasn't necessarily proof of malicious intent behind any single feature, but rather a well-documented, repeated pattern of rolling out privacy-relevant changes, silently, without clear, proactive communication, and allowing users to discover changes to their own devices after the fact, rather than being properly informed in advance and given a genuine, meaningful choice. That pattern, more than any single technical detail about SafetyCore's actual source code, is really what continues to drive the ongoing distrust surrounding this specific rollout. Now let's talk about the regulatory and legal landscape surrounding this kind of feature, because this isn't purely a matter of public opinion or forum backlash. It increasingly intersects with real privacy law. Under frameworks like the General Data Protection Regulation in the European Union, companies are generally required to obtain clear, informed, affirmative consent before processing certain categories of personal data. And while on-device processing occupies something of a legal gray area compared to sending data to external servers, regulators and privacy commissioners in multiple jurisdictions have increasingly signaled interest in scrutinizing exactly this kind of automated scanning feature, particularly when it touches on sensitive content categories and runs by default without clear opt-in consent. In the United States, privacy law remains considerably more fragmented, without a single comprehensive federal privacy statute, but a growing number of individual states have passed their own comprehensive privacy laws in recent years, generally granting residents rights to know what data is being collected about them, request deletion of that data, and in some cases, opt out of certain types of automated processing altogether. Whether SafetyCore's specific technical implementation fully satisfies the letter of these various regulations is a legitimate open question that will likely take time and possibly formal regulatory inquiry to fully resolve, but the mere existence of this evolving legal landscape adds real weight to the argument that companies rolling out this kind of feature should be building in clear consent mechanisms from the outset, rather than defaulting to silent installation and waiting to see whether backlash or legal challenge forces a change in approach after the fact. Now, let's turn to something genuinely practical. What you can actually do if you want to check whether this affects your specific device, understand what you're looking at, and take action based on your own personal comfort level, because regardless of how you feel about the broader privacy implications, everyone deserves to know what's running on their own phone and have the ability to make their own fully informed choice rather than relying on secondhand summaries. To check for Android System SafetyCore on your device, start by opening your phone's Settings app, then navigate to Apps or Application Manager, depending on your specific device manufacturer's interface, and you will likely need to tap an option to show system apps or show all apps, since services like this are often filtered out of the default. Simplified app list view by default, specifically to keep that list less cluttered for average users. Once you can see the full list, search for SafetyCore directly by name. If you find it installed, you can typically tap into it from that same settings page to view its current permissions in detail, which lets you see exactly what access it currently has to things like storage, network connectivity, and other device functions. Depending on your specific Android version and device manufacturer, you may have the option to fully disable the app, uninstall recent updates to revert it to a more minimal baseline state, or in some cases remove it entirely, though on some devices, because it's classified as a system component, complete removal without additional technical steps may not be straightforward. Enforcing its removal through unofficial methods could potentially affect other Google messages, safety features you might actually want to keep. Beyond this one specific app, it's worth adopting some broader habits for staying on top of what's actually installed and running on your phone, regardless of whether the source is Google, a device manufacturer, a third-party developer, or anyone else quietly adding software to your device without clear notice. Make a habit of periodically reviewing your complete list of installed apps, including system apps and any apps that have been disabled rather than fully uninstalled, not just the icons visible on your home screen or app drawer. Pay especially close attention anytime an existing app requests new permissions immediately following an update, since this kind of permission creep is a common technique both legitimate companies and genuinely malicious actors use to quietly expand what an app can access without most users fully noticing the change as it happens. Keep Google Play Protect turned on at all times, and consider scheduling regular automated scans through it, since it functions as Android's built-in malware and unwanted software detection. System, continuously checking installed apps against known threat signatures. And if you want an additional independent layer of scrutiny beyond what's built into Android by default, installing a reputable third-party mobile security application can provide a genuinely useful second opinion on what's actually running on your device, and exactly what data each app has access to, since relying on a single vendor's own internal security tooling to police that same vendor's own apps carries an obvious potential conflict of interest. It's also critically important to draw a clear, honest distinction here between a legitimate, publicly disclosed Google system feature like Safety Core, whatever your personal opinion of how poorly it was communicated, and actual malicious spyware, which represents a meaningfully different and generally far more dangerous category of threat entirely. Genuine spyware, the kind commonly used by stalkers, abusive partners, or other malicious actors specifically targeting an individual, typically disguises itself as a completely innocuous system file, or a fake, generic-sounding app like a bogus system update or Wi-Fi service listing, deliberately hides itself entirely from your app drawer and home screen, so it's never casually stumbled upon, often requests device administrator privileges specifically to make itself significantly more difficult to remove through normal uninstallation methods, and is explicitly deliberately designed from the ground up to secretly transmit your private messages, call logs, photos, and precise real-time location to a remote server controlled entirely by whoever installed it on your device, frequently with no legitimate company name, no public Play Store listing, and no official documentation attached to it whatsoever. That represents a meaningfully different threat model than a named, documented, eventually publicly acknowledged Google system service, even one that was rolled out with genuinely poor communication and understandably eroded a significant amount of user trust in the process. Conflating the two, treating every quietly installed first-party system app as functionally equivalent to targeted criminal stalkerware, actually does everyday users a real disservice in two separate ways. First, it can distract attention and vigilance away from real, more immediately dangerous threats like genuine stalkerware installed by someone with malicious intent and direct access to your device. And second, it makes legitimate evidence-based privacy criticism of major companies like Google easier for skeptics to dismiss as pure, uninformed paranoia rather than what it actually is, which is a fair, documented concern about consent, transparency, and communication. So where does all of this actually leave us after walking through the full picture? The honest, balanced conclusion is this. Android System Safety Core is a real, well-documented, quietly rolled out Google system service. Its officially stated purpose centers on on-device content safety scanning rather than the kind of secret real-time GPS location tracking that many sensational headlines about it tend to imply. But the manner of its rollout, silent, background installation, initially unclear and broad-seeming permissions, distribution through a channel typically reserved for essential security patches rather than new feature announcements and limited proactive communication, to the actual end users whose devices were affected represents a legitimate and clearly repeated pattern of behavior from Google that reasonably erodes user trust over time, especially when placed directly alongside previous lawsuits and public controversies involving location and activity tracking that reportedly continued despite users believing, based on Google's own settings language, that they had successfully opted out. This story also sits inside a much larger, ongoing global conversation about on-device content scanning generally, a conversation that Apple's own controversial, ultimately scaled-back 2021 proposal helped bring into the mainstream, and one that privacy advocates, security researchers, and increasingly regulators and lawmakers continue to watch closely, because the core underlying tension using powerful, automated scanning technology to protect vulnerable users from genuinely harmful content, while simultaneously avoiding the creation of a scanning infrastructure that could later be expanded or misused well beyond its original narrow purpose, remains fundamentally unresolved across the entire industry, not just at Google specifically. Whether you personally choose to keep this specific feature enabled on your own device, disable it after reviewing its permissions yourself, or dig further into Google's official documentation and any regulatory findings that emerge over time to make your own fully informed decision is entirely up to you and your own personal risk tolerance and privacy priorities. But the goal of this video was to make sure you walked away actually understanding the eReal documented verifiable facts of this specific situation, along with the broader historical and regulatory context surrounding it, rather than either dismissing the entire story as nothing worth worrying about or swinging to the opposite extreme and treating it as definitive proof of some sweeping, secret, coordinated surveillance. Conspiracy. Because neither of those extremes accurately reflects what has actually been reported, documented, and confirmed by credible sources so far. If you found this deep, thorough breakdown genuinely useful, and if you want to stay ahead of the next privacy story like this one before the sensational clickbait headlines get out ahead of the actual verified facts, make sure you're subscribed with notifications turned on, because stories exactly like this one, about how the devices we all carry in our pockets every day actually handle our personal data, our images, and our privacy, are only going to keep coming as this technology continues to advance. And having a clear, patient, genuinely well-researched source to help you separate documented reality from exaggerated internet rumor is exactly the kind of content this channel exists to provide, week after week, story after story.